Good morning. I want to thank Goretti and the INC for giving me the pleasure and honor to once again chair the Cashew Roundtable. And I want to thank Irene and Julia for indispensable assistance in trying to put together a program here for us. I'd like to introduce, I'll give a little further introduction. Wim is the Director of Tree Nuts and Ingredients at Intersnack Procurement, a subsidiary of Intersnack Group. He's responsible for the central procurement of materials and services needed by the group's management units across Europe. Active in the food industry for more than 25 years, Wim previously held positions as lead buyer, raw materials, sales manager, B2B, and sourcing manager, Africa. Harry joined Treehouse Foods in February 2017 as Vice President of Procurement. Prior to joining Treehouse, Harry was head of procurement for snacks and beverages unit at Kraft Heinz Food Company. From 2005 to 2012, Harry was at Olam International, where he led sales and marketing for the U.S. edible nuts business in Atlanta. Earlier, Harry was director and partner at Occam International, a nut trading company based in London. Ganesh is Senior Vice President, Cashew Sales and Marketing in the U.S. He's been employed by Olam for 14 years, mostly in cashews. Prior to his role in the U.S., he was in charge of cashew sales marketing in the EU, based out of Olam's Rotterdam office. Ganesh has experience in cashew production, having served as Olam's cashew business unit head in Vietnam. In between his roles in cashews, he had a brief stint in Olam's peanut business in Argentina. I'm David Rosenblatt, president of Richard Franco Agency, where I've been for the last 40 years. I would like to give you a little bit of background before we get into any questions and get into some statistics. I had the fortunate suggestion of Michael Waring to give you some of these statistics that were presented at the PTNPA in January. So I will try to get there here. I'll come to that. This is a general price guide of 4 primary grades of cashews, which from 2012, actually started it earlier, and going up to 2019. I think we're going to specialize in the 2012 onward period. What we're trying to show is that the supply growth occurred, significant supply growth occurred between 2012 and 2015, and prices were generally pretty stable, as you can see from this chart. Then 2016, there was a shortage, which drove prices higher, particularly with the consumption having been built up quite a bit. Speculation then occurred on the raw nut level and on the kernel level, which maintained high prices for a longer period of time than many of us would have hoped. In 2018, prices collapsed until a decision was made in Tanzania not to release a raw material, which caused a spike, which you can see toward the end of this period. So, see if I can point out those issues. This is a chart of the major raw cashew growing areas, how they've grown over this period of time, and how the overall supply has grown. During the period of 2012 to 2015, crops grew at an annual rate of approximately 7.5%. Buyers had an easy time obtaining supply. Cashews were competitively priced with other nuts. Dietary suggestions had helped to increase nut consumption, and confectionery use increased dramatically. So, as you can see, as we mentioned, the stable price structure occurred, and then this will sort of illustrate how the prices changed. And that brings us to a different side of this market. In order to understand the supply side of cashews, it's important to understand that much of the crops are grown in different countries than where they are shelled, and how long the supply line is. So as you can see, West Africa is a very big producer, as seen in the light green, of crops, but very little production of shelled kernels. I think there's a chart here that'll show you the arrows. The blue arrows are intended to show the raw nuts. Most of the raw nuts are exported. The red arrows show you the difference between domestic production and imports of raw nuts for further processing and shelling into kernels. So we'll get to, with the questions, we'll get to some of what the effect of this is. Then we had the situation with Tanzania. That's going to be my first question, but before I get into that, I'd like to explain that 80% of the raw cashews in the world come from the northern hemisphere, only about 20% from the southern hemisphere. Of that 20%, most comes from Tanzania. They have about 40% of the southern hemisphere crop. So a decision was made by the government of Tanzania not to allow raw cashew exports during the prime season, which recently ended. This had a tremendous impact on the perceived availability of cashews. So there was a spike in the kernel market that related to that. However, that spike was short-lived as other crops started to come online. So this chart, I'm not going to read you all the statistics, but this will show you that we have cashews coming from a large number of countries. 16 are listed here, but there are many more. I guess one of the questions I'm going to get to, maybe I'll start this with Wim. Wim, crop estimates in producing countries are an art form. So I'd like to know, how do we get more reliable statistics? How do we get a better understanding of how to convert this into a meaningful understanding about kernel availability? Maybe you'd like to start with, or any of you would like to?
I can't really.
Oh, you can't hear me?
That clearly, so.
Aha. Well, let me come over here and see if that helps. I wanted to have you explain how we can convert information about like this into reasonable understanding of what the availability will be of kernels. These are raw nut supplies, some of which are processed promptly, some of which aren't. How do we try to, as an industry, get more reliable information to be able to do better planning for consumption? Wim, this is I'll throw this one at you.
Okay. Well, as far as I can oversee, there is no scientific basis for crop forecasting. It's not, I don't see that. My experience is mainly in West and East Africa. These are very immature industries over there. It is smallholder farming. There is no USDA who organizes an objective crop forecast. And so it is more what we hear from farmers, what we hear from our trade partners, that we say, okay, this is more or less the crop of this year. Is there a harmattan, this Sahara winds kicking in or not, which can negatively impact the crop or not? But I think it's time to really to establish a professional crop forecasting. That is in the industry, in the interest of the industry in total, but also for the smallholder farmers and for the countries in itself.
Well, both Ganesh and Harry have had some experience in this area. Do you think such a thing is possible? Is there a way to go about supplying this kind of data that Wim's talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look across a lot of different industries that are not dissimilar, if you look at cocoa, coffee, those sort of things, I think you can see, very very accurate data on how the crops are flowing and the produce and the yield expectations and so on and so forth. So I don't think it's impossible to do. I think it's a function of how much it gets invested in that and under what body it gets done. Now, clearly, as we all know, the industry is tremendously fragmented. There are individual players in each of the countries that everybody is aware of. So how do you create enough vested interest and funding to be able to take forward such a project that's sort of universally beneficial for the cashew business is the challenge. And I think we would certainly, as we think about our roasting and salting business and how we want to serve our customers better, clearly price volatility, which is fundamentally driven by, I would say, some of the misunderstanding that goes on in crop sizes, the speculation that goes on in crop sizes every year, actually doesn't do the industry much favor. So there is, from a stakeholder point of view, there's certainly an imperative across the supply chain to try and address this. And maybe, again, it's something under the Global Cashew Council we can also discuss as a group.
So, Ganesh, you have any?
Yeah, so the crop forecasting, when we do any professional forecasting, as you're suggesting, is going to take some time. And we need a base level data before which we can say what is the variability in the crop between previous years and this year's. But till such a time, I think we can take lessons from history and what we have recorded as crops, because most of the crops in the African region are exported out. So you can easily do the material balance to know what was the crop last year. That's a very good analysis to understand whether our expectation of crop has met with the reality or not. So when we do the study, even with you, if you take the INC data and do the study, we can actually realize that the crop has been pretty robust. Okay, and we've had a lot of volatility in sentiments, but the base level crop growth has been pretty standard. And if you take the crop growth from one year to the next, and I've done this over the last 12 years, which is the INC data that was presented, you can see 75% of the years, the crop was higher than the previous year. Okay, and in the last 6 to 7 years, most of the years, the crop was higher than the previous year. And you've presented 7.5% growth rate in the crop. The INC data would show around 12%, 5% CAGR. So obviously the crop is growing. Africa is growing double the average growth rates of the industry. So once we understand this as participants and then try to put in effort in where such crop forecasting will get maximum bang for the buck, I think we'll go a long way in stability and what we are trying to achieve.
We can certainly appreciate that accuracy in data is going to help a lot. At the same time, this is a very complex commodity. This year, it's estimated that Tanzanian crop produced about 300,000 metric tons, which, if 100% was processed in good condition, could have produced as much as 150 million pounds, more or less. None of that crop, to the best of my knowledge, has been processed at this point, and we're not really sure what the condition of this raw material is, whether it ever will be processed. If it's processed, what the outturns will be. This is only the latest in many political decisions that have been made that influence the availability of cashews. So I guess the first question is, what do you think is going to happen with this huge amount of cashews? And I guess the further question is, how do we, in light of our desire to have good statistics, deal with the fact that political changes occur at the drop of a hat, unforeseen, not just in Tanzania, but in many of the countries that supply meaningful quantities of cashews?
So I can answer that, and then you can take a shot at it. Let's understand why this problem has come up. Okay, Tanzania or the Ivorian crop situation, all of this has come about because the governments want to ensure that the farmers get a fair price. Okay, so if there is a lot of volatility in the market, then the farmer is the one who's most impacted. So the ability to curtail volatility through various means and therefore find some stability in the market is what everybody is trying to achieve in their own ways. So in Tanzanian situation, I think the price that was at that time handed over to the farmer seemed to be low. And in hindsight, it's probably a very good price. But that is what decided, motivated the government to take that decision. Today, if that crop has to come out, it's probably the worst time for it to come, and the supply is going to disrupt the entire market. We don't know what is going to happen because nobody ever predicted that the government is going to do what it did. And it has never had a precedence. So we also don't know what that government is going to do going forward. To speculate that this crop is going to come out now or not is going to take a wrong turn.
Right. But if the government's goal was to make sure the farmer got a fair price for his product, the farmers did get a price for their product. It was the government itself that prevented the export and shelling of these cashews.
I agree. In hindsight, it looks like the incorrect decision. But I think at that point in time, they were referencing it with the last year's price. Yes. And that's what led to it.
When they started to organize the auctions, the prices bidded were too low in the view of the government. And therefore they stopped it and they announced, okay, we will process this ourselves. And I think it's a big tragedy because 300,000 ton crop and there's maybe a 10,000 ton installed capacity. So it takes 30 years. A crop needs to flow, and it needs to flow out of a country at a fair price, and also at a market-conform price. It is volatility that is impacting so much and makes it very difficult to assess what is the right price.
Yeah, I'd add to that also. I think the challenge at this point is a couple of things. One is there's been some speculation in some of the conversations I've had about whether they would just leave it to rot and not actually let it out at all. I think that ultimately, to everybody's point, a dollar in Tanzania is very valuable to them, and given the size, call it even 250,000 tons after maybe some of the quality depreciation has come out, it's still a tremendous return. So they likely will sell it, and I think the challenge is when, as Ganesh said, when it actually comes into the market, going back to the earlier point of how do we manage prices, or how do we at least anticipate the impact of this additional volume coming into the market, and the timing of that also makes it very tricky from a kernel perspective, as we potentially see some pressure on kernel prices if they certainly wanted to exit it, probably potentially less than the next round of Southern Hemisphere crops that we see today as well. So that is a challenge that I think we, again, face in terms of how do we manage that from a shelf price point of view, and manage that with our retailers as well.
Well, beyond this, as I understand it, currently the Ivory Coast, the largest producer of raw cashews in the world, has set an official minimum price for the export of cashews. As I understand it, the price that's actually trading in the bush is extremely low, partly because it's difficult to sell the raw cashews at prices. It's either going out of the country through smuggling or somehow or the other being sold underneath the official price. But the flow and movement of the raw material has slowed, and therefore the actual price going to the farmer may be lower than it would be if the price of the raw cashews was lower. So this also leads, not only does it hurt the farmer, but it leads to lack of clarity in terms of availability, not only of the quantity of raw material and the kernels that will come from it, but the quality. When certain countries that have a lot of sophistication in handling raw cashews harvest their cashews, they dry them properly, bag them, and the cashews will keep almost undamaged for quite some time. But there are others that are newer to the industry, for one reason or the other, don't have that sophistication to protect the value of the product. How do we help address this situation, and how do we, people who are trading, buying, roasting, salting, consuming cashews, how do we make heads or tails out of this?
If I may respond to that, David, I think we can characterize this market as a disconnected market. It's disconnected from farmer, say basically to roaster, but it's also disconnected in the country because the government interference, as we have seen, in the end also farmers pay the price for that. So it is not helping at all. It is very complex supply chain, and therefore there are no easy solutions. But I would plea for more cooperation between larger farmer groups and, for example, larger buying organizations in order to reduce the volatility. And I think that is the way going forward.
Yeah, so I think from the point of view of the roaster soldier, I think as you look upstream into the supply chain and how it works and the disconnection that Wim talks about, I think you have to go back 3-4 years to really understand the genesis of how we got to the situation where you end up with such a big downturn in the cycle of the market last year in terms of the pricing in shell. And how that was driven really not so much by kernel consumption, which if you go back and look at absolute kernel consumption in Europe and the US, has actually been only stymied by the higher prices, right? And I think last year when we talked about this, we anticipated a slowdown in consumption of cashews in these markets only because given the lead times, the shelf price started to reflect that and consumers stepped back. So the reality is that cashews are loved by consumers. They want to eat the cashews. There's really limited support for cashew from a health messaging point of view. But as you think about the supply side and this disconnect, the speculation on the in-shell as we went through those first, we'll go back 4 years to 2016, you saw early prices in Ivory Coast as they started to bid the market up. Certainly, obviously has to flow through on a parity basis to shellers in Vietnam. And so as a kernel buyer, to go back to the point on the information, to be able to see this speculation early in the Northern Hemisphere crop cycle means that we have to react to that to manage risk. And that's essentially what we're trying to do, is manage the risk on the buying side. It's not a positional play. So how do we solve for this? I think, again, there has to be more clarity around crop sizes. I think it's imperative we talk about getting better information so people can take better decisions and manage for the risk.
I'm going to ask Ganesh to help us explain a little more of the whole supply process. Unlike most commodities that we deal with here at this meeting, the supply chain, as Harry mentions, is very long. We have harvests done by generally small farmers, if you will, and then they pass through perhaps many hands before they get to a processor or are exported to another country for processing. There's a whole network of raw material dealers, traders, speculators, whatever, I guess, depending on whether you want a friendly term or an unfriendly term. Whatever it is, there is a trade of raw cashews. It is almost a separate commodity from the kernels that we deal with. Then we have the whole process of actually transporting, getting them to processors all around the world, and various issues that come up in that supply chain. The processor is a middleman. He's having to buy the raw material, he has to finance, and then export and create markets. Maybe you can help us better understand where the problems are in the smoothness of the supply chain from the farmer right up to the importer who brings it in a consuming country.
So to answer this, let's understand the base of how cashews are grown. Cashew growing is restricted to smallholder farmers. Let's say 1 or 2 acres to a hectare is probably the average crop holding. And the way the tree yields, unlike what I see in California and almonds and all, is that the crop extends over 3 months. And actually every tree harvests over 3 months. or 2 months, you can say, depending on how you want to call it. So it's not a one-time harvest activity or 1 or 2 times harvest activity. Every tree in cashews, give and take, however you do the math, would give you a handful of cashews a day. And the farmer, if he has 250 trees, 300 trees, he has to go and harvest this handful of cashews every day. So what he does there is to collect it, to be able to then, it's not economically viable for him to take it, aggregate it, and bring it to a large trader. So there necessarily need to be aggregators in between, who will then have to take this handful of cashews, aggregate them into bagfuls, and then to small truckloads, and then get them onto a level where it is transportable to an area or a warehouse. So in this supply chain, because of the necessity and the small size of everyday harvest, and also the perishable nature of the crop, it is very important to have intermediaries. And if this intermediary does not get a daily buy and sell order, he is forced to buy or he is forced to sell, and therefore leads to speculation. It's very unfortunate, but I think that's part of the chain, and that is why those people are present there. So as we go forward, then the first level or second level aggregators are also having the same issues of buy and sell, and buy orders and sell orders not coming at the same time. So they're forced to hold stock. And in order to get certainty of the raw material, there is a lot of advances that are given out to farmers which are unsecured. So there is again a supply which is going to come against these advances, whereby he is long. Now, if this intermediary is going to lose money for any reason due to a fluctuation in the market, he's going to hold and try and see what best he can do to make sure that he can overcome his losses. That is what leads to volatility. Okay, it's unavoidable. And then you go to the other side, which is the destination side or the processing side. And in Vietnam or in India, where typically large-scale processing happens, there would be a processor who would buy this from that intermediary or a trader. And if he's not having an opportunity to sell kernels against his purchase, then he'll be forced to sell that raw seed again to another party. Again, there comes another intermediary in this transaction. So, which is how we have layered in so many intermediaries, just because of the supply chain being devoid of long-term transactions. And if kernel buying happens at a very regular basis, at a reasonable price, okay, not trying to time the bottom of the market, I think a lot of these problems would get curtailed.
Good. Well, what I want to do is I wanted to set a stage for both Wim and Harry to talk about the complexities of the extent of this supply chain. There is a necessity to have a lag between the prices at which raw nuts are trading, which processors base their kernel sales on, and the arrival, processing, and retailing of the finished product. When you think in terms, correct me if I'm wrong, but let's say today you get a shipment from, you buy some raw material in the Ivory Coast, or maybe I should say Guinea-Bissau for timing, but regardless, if you take a purchase in May and let's say it's shipped in June or July, has to go around Africa and get all the way to Vietnam. It has to go through the government processes. It'll go through warehousing. Nobody's going to have zero stock. There's going to be some inventory, as you've mentioned. By the time it's processed, graded, packed, shipped, and reaches a consuming country and then goes through the same process of warehousing and so on. The length of time from when the nut is harvested until it's consumed can be in a year or more. When you get into the marketing aspect where people are selling strings of 3 or 6 months, buying long periods of time, the question really is it's a real challenge to relate to all these complexities and try to figure out how to put out a reasonable price, sustainable price to your customers. So how do you do that?
Now, in our case, it's not always related directly to the market of today. Of course, our main markets are supermarket chains, larger buyers, and therefore also larger contracts. And we need to deliver to a fixed price. And so the phenomenon of defaults that are regular coming around in the cashew supply chain, that is of course not so much liked by us. We do therefore a strict partner selection, and we rely also on their practices so that they are not forced to go into a kind of default. So it's not always related to the price of today. And last year in the Vinacas convention in Vietnam, I was also asked that question because I was telling that because of the high 2017 prices, our sales were going down between 5 and 10%. And the Vietnamese they went ballistic because they said, well, our prices go down tremendously. And so it's difficult to explain from their point of view, of course, but that is our business model.
Harry,
Yeah, I think you've covered off on the main points there for sure.
Good. Well, let me change the direction a little bit and talk to you about food safety, traceability, audits, and all that. With the complexities that Ganesh explained, how do we move into the 21st century method of protecting the quality, understanding where the background is, relating to everything from labor safety to age limits to being sure that the quality micro testing, we're dealing in countries where that's not so easy. How do you see this moving forward? Are you comfortable with ways? Is it something that falls upon the processor in the consuming country to take that issue? How do we resolve these difficulties?
So I'll tell you. So I mean, I think right now, this is this has been a perpetually challenging question, particularly as you have a background 10 to 15 years of defaults and all the other situations that come out of this. So the market has reacted to a lot of the quality issues that we've seen over the years in a lag sense, in the sense there's been no preemptive work done to prevent some of the bigger issues that have come through, maybe odor or issues like that. But what we've seen as a function of the reaction to that now is, and I can really talk from a treehouse point of view, is a lot of the work that we've done over the last couple of years upstream is to your point, David, is to address and partner with specific packers in the origin markets, and really go in with the intent of trying to help and raise the bar on quality. There is a huge selection of folks that you can go and buy cashews from in Vietnam. Not all of them have the same size, scale, capacity, and capability. And so being selective about who we choose to partner with, and then look upon it as an opportunity to, first of all, address the basic concerns about good manufacturing practices. So having HACCP, BRC, and those type of certifications is something that we certainly work with our folks to do that. But more than that is having a constant presence there and making sure that our quality group who spend time there and are there 3-4 times a year, for example, hold seminars and get-togethers to talk about how do we improve good manufacturing practices. So it's about being present, it's about being in the origin, it's about committing to that process and investing into that, because across the retailer landscape there's a scale of folks who understand the business and folks that don't understand the business. But as a company like ourselves, it's our responsibility to make sure that the product that we're producing is obviously food safe as a basic given, but also that we're doing much more to build out on the quality side. And the other piece that comes out of that is obviously building up the traceability component. So again, we talked about this tremendously complex supply chain and the time it takes to get from Africa to Vietnam to process. But trying to build a supply system that allows us to track and trace the product as it comes through our partner processors, understand where that raw cashew nut has come from, so that when issues do come up, we have a system whereby we can go back and address that problem from a root cause basis. So it's time and effort and commitment to resources in doing that, and I think what we're seeing, certainly from the conversations we have, more and more people from roast to salter side doing this work and taking this on. But I'd also compliment tremendously the development of the Vietnamese processing industry over the last 5 years in terms of really starting to understand what the customer wants. And as I say, if we have a seminar in Vietnam to talk about good manufacturing practices and how you can benefit that, you only do that when you have an audience that's prepared to listen. So I would say just the tremendous steps that the Vietnamese industry has made over the last 5 years to step up, make investments in those plants is dramatic. The challenge is when you get the pricing shifts that we've had over the last 12 to 18 months, that makes it very difficult for these folks also to continue in those investments. So again, I think the support that we want to give is a constant one, which also, as I think we talked a little bit about, helps manage this risk on the supply side. So I would say that.
Yeah, I would like to add to that driven by the volatility, also we see a lot of process steps being outsourced. Being outsourced to workshops that are not in the scope of, for example, BRC. So that is a hazardous thing to happen. And that should be prevented. But it is, we know that the Vietnamese cashew industry lost a lot of money last year. And so it is in order to survive. We understand it from that point of view, but it is definitely not the direction in which the industry should develop. Together with the companies of the gentlemen, we work also together in ComCashew, or the African Cashew Initiative, and focusing. That is work upstream. And so together we trained more than 500,000 farmers, on good agricultural practices, on yield improvement, because there is a big yield gap, in order to get more clarity, more visibility, more transparency, cooperation, so in order to professionalize also the agricultural part of things.
Well, I think that's very useful for us to be thinking about. It's a process. I guess the other area that I ought to go into is everybody probably have some view of how do we see the market moving forward. I'd like to sort of come on Wim's comment that this is an industry that various levels have been undercapitalized from time to time. With the price drop of the last year or so, I think it's put a lot of stresses on the supply chain, raw cashew dealers, processors. Every level has taken losses for one reason or the other, which has also impacted the availability of bank financing for cashews. So on the one hand, it appears that we have a good supply of raw material that's going to be available for processing. On the other hand, it's not so easy to move this raw material into the hands of processors and create an excess of kernels because it requires investment. And at each level, there's a sort of a limited degree of risk that each one wants to take. So how do you see the next year, the next 2 or 3 years developing, barring any major political or physical crop problems? How is the market going to develop, come out of this drop and thrive? Are we going to have another period like 2012 to 2015 where we'll have 3-4 years of pretty attractive pricing, or will we look for the next disaster of one form or the other that occurs, unfortunately, here and there?
So we see cycles in commodities are very natural. So as players in commodities, we should be aligned to the bull and bear cycles and stability in between. So today we probably have passed the worst hopefully. But when we just see the supply demand that governs the pricing today, I think there is reasonable supply, as you rightly said. How is it going to go to the farmer? We have already seen a shift in pattern, which is in Africa, a lot of arrivals, especially in Ivory Coast, would come very early in the season. Today, arrivals in Ivory Coast are very slow. Okay, it's probably 70% of what it was last year, same time. So the rest 30% is probably held back at the farmer level because of lack of liquidity and will get slowly traded. So the market is already aligned to the slower pace of financing by banks by holding inventory at the farmer level and releasing it slowly to the processor. So the processor's working capital requirements go down. I don't think it is going to disrupt the supply chain beyond this. So my expectation is once there is stability in pricing, everybody can see business, and the banks are are not going to say no to loans when the processor is able to rotate that into money. On the longer term perspective, I believe the last 3-4 years of high prices, and especially the Ivory Coast minimum price declaration about 5 years back, has led to motivated farmers. Okay, they probably their income has doubled or tripled over the last several years, barring this year. So they would have definitely planted more acreage. So we would see acreage growth and therefore supply to be growing, because cashew is a very good commodity and it's a very, very good nut. We need that supply to be able to back it so that retailers can promote that product. I feel we are in a safe zone. There is enough supply, there is good demand, and I think like to answer the previous question also and the comments by Wim and Harry, every participant today is taking the right steps to develop the industry. And it's not a question of punishment, but it's a system of rewards, and training, which is kind of marrying everything together. And the recipe is right for the cashew industry as a whole to come to the next level of maturity.
Good. I think maybe this is a good time to try to take questions from the audience. We see if there's something we can address that we haven't thought of. Thank you.
A couple of questions in, you need to post them. Don't forget to refresh.
Right, thank you. Okay. This first question is, what is your prediction on the price for the next 6 months? Continue or dropping? Anybody dare to answer that question?
I mean, I think Ganesh answered it well. I think we've got sufficient supply in the system, and I think again once the banking side of it comes back into the Vietnamese processing industry, I think as long as we can see some parity with the in-shell prices and the kernel prices as we go forward, and think about destination market Q3, Q4 sales, which as most of you will know, seasonality-wise, this industry tends to do best around the holiday period in Europe and US around Q4. So in this narrow window of opportunity, given lead times of 90, 120 days, I think as long as the supply can come out, and obviously we talked a little bit about Tanzania and the timing of when that may double up on their crop this year, we don't know. But if it comes out a little bit earlier, I think that would certainly support some stable pricing now for the balance of the year. I think what gets interesting is as we get into February, March, or into Jan, Feb, March next year, is just seeing where, given the current prices, and a lot of the data would show we're starting to see a tick up in some of the demand at the current pricing. And that's, by the way, a function of the basket of nuts having come down, deflated over the last year as well. We're now in a really unusual position. As you think about a mixed nut canister, most of the costs of that in the commodity side have been reasonably stable. So as we start to see that consumption play through this year, I think next year becomes quite interesting from a cashew point of view, and I hope we continue to see as Ganesh pointed out, farmers who have a high expectation of a reasonable return continue to invest into good agricultural practices to support the supply. So hopefully we'll get some stability longer term.
Either of you want to touch this one? Well, let me give it to you in a different way, since there's another question here. As we see, raw cashew nut is 7 to 8 years low. I'm not sure that's correct, but that's what this says. What about kernel? Will kernel price be stable in the near future, or is this the bottom? And in the future, will demand for kernel increase because of the low prices? I think that history tells us that that has always been the case. The real question is, how long will it take? How long does it take from when prices are attractive to go through the process of creating increased demand, absorbing the excess supply, and creating a firm market? Anybody have a...
Yeah, I think that's what you already showed in the introduction. The market, consumer market is growing when retail prices are stable. And so also when kernel prices are stable. And that is what we need to aim for.
Do you feel that the current price structure is now being reflected at retail?
I mean, history would tell us that we normally have a 6 to 8 month lag from when prices really come down. But again, this is 6 months is a nice thing to look at to say, if I buy in January and by July or August, that's going to be reflected. Now, this is a market that comes down and goes up over time. So this is a layered process. So I would absolutely argue that, again, Q3, Q4, again, as much a function of the basket of the cost of nuts and not just cashew, will help drive consumption. So.
Well, that brings up sort of another point to this. We saw the prices come down quite some time ago, but then we had the Tanzanian phenomenon, the prices spiked. For those of you who are negotiating a long contract, 6 months, a year contract, and the price jumps up like that, there had to have been some uncertainty. Did that relatively brief spike delay putting price structure into place? No, it didn't.
No, because normally when prices go down, buyers tend to wait. And when this small hiccup caused more sales, basically.
Good. Okay, here's another one that I'm going to let one of you guys answer, not me, but kickbacks to African country officials is a major concern for cashew seed buyers. Is there a way to counter this, to be socially responsible? It can equate to $300 a ton. I don't know where that comes from, but I think there's a point here. Is there anything about this that we can address?
I don't think so.
Okay.
No.
Let's try again. Let's see if there's anything else here. Let's see. There's a few more, I think. Could you discuss how you see the shift of processing from Asia to Africa? Many say this is inevitable, but how do you see this happening?
I can take that. So I think Africa, if you see in the last few years, the processing capacity has improved. And we are seeing shipments out of Africa land up with top customers and being welcomed. This is the start of the transition from Vietnam to Africa. So we have to rewind 10, 15 years to understand that India was a very major origin or processing origin for cashews. And that moved to Vietnam for cost competency. And in Vietnam, there is a lot of competition for labor. And we see more and more companies going to Vietnam to set up shop there, which is also going to intensify the competition for labor. And the cost of processing is going to go up eventually. Either we mechanize to such an extent that we are able to neutralize it, or the industry will have to move to Africa, where the freight economics would probably compensate for the efficiency loss. I would venture a guess by saying 6 to 7 years, we would see reasonably high processing volumes out of Africa. And that will bring in an ecosystem of other auxiliary services which are required for the cashew industry. And after that period would be exponential growth.
Here's a different kind of a question. How much can cashews substitute other nuts like almonds, pistachios in India for festival season and lower prices? I think there's a broader question here. It would be interesting to have you address, not only in India, but all over the world, how cashew consumption relates to the consumption of competing tree nuts?
Well,
Yeah, go ahead, please go
okay,
ahead.
well, we saw last year when prices were so high that consumers went for other products as well. So it's not the Indian season. Our sales market is Europe, and so there is definitely price elasticity. But it cannot necessarily go to other nuts. Can also be to other snacks, of course.
So,
Yeah.
well, I was going to say is from the point of view of we've done a lot of work, statistical work, going back in time and seeing if there's so there's very limited correlation between the nut types actually in terms of if you think about how you might hedge a cashew market. But your point is exactly right, Wim. There is certainly a movement, and I think the differences between a mature market like the US and Europe versus more of a cash market where inventory cycles and inventory turns are much, much faster, and China is a similar one where you do see the impact of pricing much, much more quickly in terms of consumption increasing against lower prices. US, as we talked about, takes a lot longer for it to play through, just because of the nature of the supply chain. So overall, again, low prices definitely do drive demand up, and that's the same for any nut type. The question is, what does the basket look like? Really, that's what we have to look at.
Good. Well, one other question that reverts back to perhaps where we were earlier. What is the increase in carryover stock into this year? I spoke to Ganesh about this in some detail when we were trying to put the figures together. And the concept of understanding what the carryover stock is extremely difficult. We were talking about how do we make these statistics reliable, and I think Ganesh said it's easier to sort of get a sense of whether the stock has increased or decreased rather than get the absolute quantity. But it's a very good question. Does anybody want to comment on what the carryover stock, both of raw nuts and kernels, may be like this year?
If I tell you a number, everybody will be bearish here.
No, don't give it.
But let me venture a guess. So when we talk about 3.6 million tons crop, and everybody in the supply chain has a month of inventory, okay? So a month of inventory is equivalent to the Tanzanian crop. So that's about 150 million pounds of kernels. That's at the bare minimum, okay? And we will have various roasters or retailers or intermediaries in the chain having between 1 and 3 months of stock, depending on what products they are dealing with. And then there are other stockists and finished goods warehouses which have inventory for shipping out. So if you take all these together, you can easily venture a guess as to between 300 to 600 million pounds, or at least 300 million pounds, But it's not all marketable. It is not in a place, and it's not actually looking for a home. It's just that most of them are committed, but they're waiting because of buffer inventory. And not too many people will be willing to draw down on that inventory. So the carryover stock, in essence, is only the delta between last year and this year. And that is probably equivalent to, you can do the math, 450 to 550,000 tons of raw seed equivalent.
I think one of the points I'm trying to drive at here is that carryover stock comes in the form of raw nuts and kernels. When it's in the form of raw nuts, it depends a great deal on where it is, how it's stored, how it was treated throughout, where it's going to be processed, when it's going to be processed. So it's extremely difficult, as you say, Ganesh, to give a number. When it's converted into kernels and there's carryover stock, it's a lot easier for us to try to estimate it. I think we're running out of time. If anybody has any further comment, I'd be happy to entertain it.
No, it's what you say, the carryover in raw cashew nuts, the quality will deteriorate over time. And so it is not, you cannot compare it with carryover number in pistachios or in almonds. The turnout will worsen. So that is not correlated to a number of kernels.
It's absolutely true. Well, I want to thank all of you for serving. Wim, Harry, Ganesh, thank you, and thank the INC for helping us.